in what kind of space or time you are. I welcome you to this, the third session of CITAC, the Memoria, CITAC by Memory, the series of online conversations with previous participants that commemorate 20 years of this extraordinary symposium. Thank you, online public, for being with us today. Please send your comments and questions to the appropriate Facebook or YouTube platform. I should say that this session will be conducted in English, as two of our guest speakers are native English speakers, and these will be later subtitled and uploaded to the CITAC YouTube channel in Spanish. My name is Lucia San Roman, and I currently direct the Laboratorio Arte Alameda here in Mexico City. I previously participated as speaker in one occasion and also directed the studio program of the 11th edition in 2015, Arte Justamente, Just Art, which was directed by Karin Kwoni, who's with us today. I want to start by truly thanking Aimela Barrere de Cerviche, co-founder, president, and long-standing supporter of this program and of many, many other programs in Mexico associated with contemporary art, from exhibitions to books to production of art to production of discourse. Thank you, Aime, for so many years of constant and support of all of us. As well as Bárbara Hernández, current director, and the team and board of PAC, Patronato de Arte Contemporáneo, which is the institution that hosts CITAC. Thank you for the public opportunity to invite us here today to review with you, CITAC, the singular importance in creating 20 years ago a space for dialogue around contemporary in Mexico that connected our endeavors here with interest and discourses elsewhere. Today's speakers are Pablo Helguera, who directed it in 2005, the fourth edition, Myths of Permanence and the Ephemeral. Pablo is a visual artist living in New York, Mexican or of origin, whose work spans the space between dialogue and historical artifact, including ethnography, memory, and as it says in his bio, the absurd. He has had a long career as an education and public programs curator at such esteemed institutions as the Guggenheim Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, and the Museum of Modern Art, among many others. His career as an artist is immense as well. I already apologize to all the speakers today for making such short note of their very long and important careers and interesting careers. Shudabrata Segupta directed the 10th edition in 2012, titled The Future, The Long Count Begins Again. He's an artist, curator, and co-founder of Rax Media Collective, which has an interest in textual exploration and aesthetics, surveillance, and cyberculture. He co-initiated Sarai, a platform for discursive partnerships between theorists, researchers, practitioners, and artists in South Asia. In 2008, Rax Media Collective curated Manifesta 7. He lives in Delhi. Karin Kwoni, the director of the 11th edition, Arte Justamente, Just Art, in 2015, in which I participated, is a curator, writer, and arts administrator whose work focuses on how contemporary artistic practices reflect and inform social, political, and cultural conditions. She is senior director and curator of the Vera List Center for Art and Politics at the New School. Her curatorial positions include Independent Curators International, the Swiss Institute, both in New York, where she lives, and co-founded the artist collective Repo History. Her work at the Vera List has been fundamental in fostering an extraordinarily diverse community of artists that interact with scholars and policymakers to address issues of public concern. Also with us today is Patricia Sloan, co-founding member of PAC, Patronato de Arte Contemporáneo, and therefore a key figure in the support structures that have made CITAC possible in each edition. She has managed, administered, nurtured in so many ways this program and project, as well as a generation, and by implication, a generation of contemporary practitioners, artists, theorists, scholars, curators that now grows into many generations through these platforms, but also in her work as a curator and director of Museo Carrillo Gil, co-creator of the curatorial platforms Curaduría Express and Canaía, as well as holding the position of Treasury Secretary at CIMAM, and more recently as long-term advisor for the position of the director at MUAC. Thank you all very much for being here today. I'm going to go a little bit briefly over the proceedings so we can orient ourselves in today's discussion. I will begin with a few remarks that will discuss each edition very briefly and will add, sort of help us think through this exercise of collective memory in time. And then we will have the following questions in order: the relevance and topic of inquiry at the time, which runs into the relevance of the topic to the current context. Then unexpected personal experience that resulted from your link to CITAC, followed by what has not yet been narrated from those editions. And finally, really important, what can CITAC be from now on? What should it be? How should it be? For whom should it be? This will be followed by Q&A. We have 2.5 hours to do this. We will probably spend 2 hours and 15 minutes on our section of things and then address questions, though we have discussed that if there are very juicy and important questions popping up in the chat, we will also address them. The order will be chronological by order of editions, starting with Pablo, then Shura, then Karen, then Patricia. Patricia will return at the end to close the sessions with remarks on behalf of the board, which will be in Spanish. So let me just begin with my part here. And just check a little bit that you're all there still. Yes, good, because I'm blinding. I don't see you when I'm reading my text. Okay. As we engage in this exercise of memory and assessment of the past, we seem to find ourselves in a fold of the space-time continuum, and perhaps a break or a pause in the idea of the contemporary, in the obvious way of sensing the present as the continuation of the past. The contemporary seems fragile, permeable, unpredictable, discontinuous. So much and so little is happening for many of us in terms of politics, affect, relationality, relationships, economy, which leads to the impression that we may have entered a new territory where the fulcrum points of democracy, autonomy, aesthetic and otherwise, and citizenship are being reshaped. So given doubts over the present, it is not yet clear what these pandemic times will do to the idea of the future. But descriptions of today, of this particular moment in global and local cultures and politics, and therefore of artistic production, seem not just uncertain, but indeterminate, meaning it may be not possible to locate us in space and time at once. This perception reminds me of Shura's central argument in the 10th edition, The Future, the Long Count Begins Again, where he takes as a point of departure the year 2012, which marked the end of the 5,126 cycle in the Mesoamerican long count calendar, and the beginning of a new era. Little did he know that a decade later, we would have arrived at that place where history again seems to commence, and the future is no longer as manifest a destiny of the recent or distant past, a moment so full of present that to speak of what is to come seems foolhardy, like giving ourselves courage, even though the flashlight with which we have been lighting the path is faltering. Which reminds me of the device we have thus far used to build the discursive edifice of our present, history, and for this symposium, art history, as a mechanism of reckoning with what was once, and of addressing and parceling out the now, but also, and perhaps more importantly, as a way to have a say in the manner of construction of the device itself, pointing, as Pablo's 4th edition, Myths of Permanence and the Ephemeral, did, to 3 aspects of the relationship between history and contemporary art. And I quote, the envisioning, production, and assimilation of text, the current variables that modify the understanding and assimilation of history, and the way history is shaped by economic forces. And so in that edition, almost uniquely in the series, the past and the present are set against each other, using that very Western model of continuity and discontinuity that nevertheless remains faithful to the storyline, a system imperfect, as it has often left so much outside of the text. As Pablo's and Shura's editions made patently clear, and has been evidenced in many others, the discourse on art as a supposed autonomous field has over the last 10 years increasingly left the bounds of the discipline, following the obstinate desires of artists and thinkers to step outside and redress the social conditions within which they operate and address the world. Karin's arte, justamente, just art, boldly told us. CITAC 12 states that artists and their projects, working in collaboration with other disciplines and agents out of the art scene, can trace the way towards the creation of a more just society. It did so by focusing on 3 research lines related to justice: education, food, and gender, and atomizing the symposium format by advancing and enlarging the pedagogical script into a research and dialogue platform in different parts of Mexico, not just in Mexico City, pairing an international artist or collective with local agents. And so it seems to me that the question of what happened then begins to allow us to divine a new measure for this present. This platform, CITAC, has been a useful and successful device thus far, but yet we may need one that can take into account the fundamental uncertainty of addressing today, both in one time and one space, anything, as the world has become multiple worlds, parallel to one another, ensconced within each other, contradictory, a mess, permeable to fragilities of identity, agency, affect. This while also making sense and perhaps resisting the velocity and inertia of what has just been and continues, the impermeability to economic transformation and more brutal implementation of abstraction as currency, the instrumentalization of bodies into labor, sans politic, and many other troublesome tendencies in which art and artists at once play the roles of enablers, critics, agitators, agents of public discourse. And so with that introduction, I would like to proceed to the questions asked before. How did Pablo Helguera, how did your edition, what was the context of your edition? Why did you think of it? Why was it pertinent? And what may we take from it today?
First, thank you, Lucia, and thank you everyone for having us here. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with all of you and with my colleagues and friends, Shud and Karen, with whom I think we shared a lot of similar interests in our various CTACs, and it's something that I believe might be speaking about afterward. As to the origin story of this particular CTAC, I will try to lay out the basic details. Back in 2004, I was living in Mexico City, and the CTAC was still a fairly young program, organization / event that had only had 3 editions. The CTAC, and this probably has been mentioned in past conversations, was serving a very much needed purpose in the Mexican scene, which was to help expand and democratize the discussion about contemporary art and contemporary art theory, something that felt, I think, at the time insufficient in the various programs in museums or universities at the time. There was the need to really show, to connect with what's considered like the contemporary art debate globally. Anyway, this CTAC in 2005 became the 4th edition, and Osvaldo Sanchez, as I recall, had contacted me from the PAC committee to propose an idea for this particular edition. I have always been interested in the subject of history as an artist, as an educator, and I was feeling at the time that the discussion about history in the contemporary art context was important for a number of reasons. First, because I felt that there was a real need to find a new way of writing about art that was neither the traditional historical narratives that were common of like or modern histories of Mexican art, and also not the type of art criticism that was hyperly present, that was only about the day-to-day exhibitions that would happen. I felt there was like a lacking of perspective between the long count and the short count. And I felt there was a need to theorize history, not just in terms of how we narrate art, but how art also engages with history in all its different manifestations, from the way that we create canonical narratives about art, but also the way that we engage time itself as a practice. So these particular CTAC try to take this topic of history in a very broad sense, engaging with the way that history is political, that social justice and historical narratives are intertwined, how latitudes also are historical, or the way that they are demarcated, and the way that the 20th century art and 21st century art was engaging with history and with the history of art was political in the sense that it was making a kind of art that was ephemeral, and by that I mean conceptual, process art, and performance art. So I felt there was an opportunity to talk about all these different topics through this particular symposium. Additionally, I have been an educator, a museum educator for 30 years. I have left that life now. But in that, during that career, I noticed always the ways in which symposiums of this nature were very constrained by their format. And in the Mexican context specifically, I felt from the experience of the past CTACs that the need for theoretical discussion was so great that I also perceived an overcompensation of the type of like a really abstract discussions that were given to 1,000 people, which is the amount of people that actually attended the CTAC at the time. It was incredible. It was more than I have ever seen attend a Symposium of Contemporary Art even in New York. But at the same time, these presentations were so abstract that they were very difficult to grasp for the vast majority of the public. So I felt there was a really important need to think of different formats that would not specifically or only engage with very abstract ideas. So these CTAC tried to include, aside from panel discussions and presentations, interviews with specific artists. The use for or the inclusion of artists' voices is, of course, very paramount for me, not only because I'm an artist, but because I believe very strongly that when you are having a discussion that, as I say, veers a lot into the theoretical and the abstract, the artist's voice becomes really important in presenting something very concrete, very specific, that can ground and model exactly what we are talking about through a very specific practice. It was another way for me to say, well, this is in the end a discussion about art. And while we discuss globalization or global warming or politics or whatever you wanted, this is really the objective. So I mean, I can, if you want me, Lucia, I can stop. I mean, I can talk about the specific examples of those artists, but would you want me to speak about the present?
Yes, if you might, please.
Yeah. Specifically about how these CTAC of the nature of CTAC number 4, which was titled Myths of Permanence and the Ephemeral, could be updated or could actually use a next chapter. I would say that so many important things have happened since 2005 that it will be really important to include them. Not least the rise of social media, which, you know, in 2005 nobody was on Facebook, or very few, if anybody. Twitter was actually launched the next year. And as we know, social media has played an incredibly important role in the rise of populism, fake news, and the rise of an authoritarian kind of populism that needs to be addressed. You know, and I think that will be a really important aspect to think about in terms of how we build history. The subject of the local and specifically the rise of socially engaged art to me is important. As in 2005, we did not really quite have a language to really discuss this kind of work. And Tania Bruguera was in this CTAC, and we were discussing discussions around censorship and community organizing and such, but we lacked the kind of language that has evolved since that time. So I think it will be really interesting to use these to write the next chapter that will trace the growth of these what I call moments, not a movement, of social practice. And last but not least, I think the whole reflection about history, and I think my colleagues would actually comment on it, is could offer us the opportunity to really think about not just the past, but also the end of history, the end of times. Not to be too dramatic, but we do feel, I think, at least from my standpoint in the United States, that we are living some kind of crisis, some kind of definitive crisis, like we're facing some kind of the end of democracy, the catastrophe of the climate, and many other crises that we are advancing towards, and history has apparently not taught us anything. So all these different angles will be very interesting to explore back in relation to what this initial CTAC of permanence and the ephemeral offered in terms of discussions.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Shuda, I was amazed when I was reading your essay for your edition, because it's almost premonitory in some ways in this end of times, beginning of times. Could you speak more of what inspired you aside of the happenstance of it being 2012? You're silent.
That's what happens when you forget. Okay, thank you, Lucia. Thank you, all of you, dear friends. It's wonderful to be back with all of you again. I always think of anything to do with my coming to Mexico City as if it's a gathering or a reunion. It's like the CTAC is an occasion for me to revisit the past and the future of a long conversation that I've been having with this city, and with many of you actually. It's an interesting question that you posed, Lucia. This business of premonition, because I'm beginning to worry a little bit about how artists sometimes are like antennae in the future. We should be careful about what we think about, because there's a way in which things begin to happen. It's not for no reason that in thousands of years ago, the kind of people that all of us are would be somewhere between shaman and time waster, which is what I think we are. We waste time because we tell the time. We are able to tap into some unconscious currents that seem to suggest instinctively to us possibilities of the future. I in the CTAC that I directed, which is not the first CTAC that I was in, and I'll come back to the earlier CTAC that I was in as well, because I think that was a very important moment for me. The CTAC that I directed in 2012, The Future, the Long Count Begins Again, seemed to me to mark a proper beginning for the 21st century. And I say that because I think that every century has a little bit of a jet lag in time. The first decade is spent dealing with the ghosts of the past. And by the time you actually really begin to think about the future, a decade is already gone. And I think that was that feeling that I was beginning to have, I think many of us had in 2011, that finally the 20th century is behind us. It took 10 years from 2000 to 2011, 11 years for us to say goodbye to the 20th century. And I think we were beginning to say hello to the new century by the time the CTAC that I was in came about. And it seemed to be that kind of portal or a gateway time, a time between the past and the future in which it was possible to think ahead, or it was a time that demanded that we think ahead, not just in terms of what's going to happen the next year or the year after that, but in terms of what we call the long count. I've always maintained that one of the problems of contemporary art is that it has a very limited time horizon. Contemporary art and contemporaneity seems to exist between now and the next, the next exhibition. In the last 2 years, we've been in a kind of suspended time, so that contemporaneity itself has become more stretched out than we've experienced it before, which gives us pause and an occasion to rethink what we mean by the future. The future isn't just the next Documenta. The future isn't just the next Venice Biennale or the next art fair. The future can be as far away as 50,000 years into the future. And I think about this very carefully because I think that the contemporary artists of the Neolithic times who were marking their presence on the caves and the surfaces which they mark their presences in are still with us. So that when we look at prehistoric art, we're not just seeing it as a signal from the remote past to our present, which is the future of that remote past, but we're also seeing it as part of our contemporary witness. So I think as artists, as curators, as critics, we need to understand that we have an audience and a public that may be very far away from us in time. And that's important to me because it's not just that we're talking to this time, our time here and now, but that we're actually addressing a distant future. We're creating the conditions for that distant future. And 2012 and the conceit, if you like, of the Mesoamerican calendar and its cyclical turn seemed to offer us a playful excuse to begin that exercise of thinking about what art owes to the future. And I say this very consciously because I'm aware of the fact that there is no inevitable necessity for any work of art to come into the world. The art, as an artist, whatever my colleagues and I make is not predicated by any inevitability. It doesn't have to be. We desire it into becoming. We choose a pathway so that it becomes real. And in that sense, that freedom from necessity, that freedom from inevitable fate, means that every work of art becomes a kind of ambassador for the future, for possibilities, because we don't have to be doing what we're doing. We choose to be doing what we're doing. And that's why I think art and the future and futurity have a kind of strange relationship, a kinship, which is not necessarily one of sequence and seriality. It's not just a question of what comes next. The futures we desire may never come into being, but our desiring them changes what will happen. And I think that is the power that art has. It seems to me that Mexico City, which for me was always a city sort of in the future from where I was, it seems to me that Mexico City was a good place and a good site to think about this and to think about this in public, in an extended, broader conversation that took art into account, but that also took a certain desire to be into account. I mean, I always remember that there is one person who sort of straddles both my city and yours, and that's the poet Octavio Paz, who spent a very long time in Delhi and very key moments of his creative life in Delhi, in a house that unfortunately doesn't really exist anymore. But I remember I quoted him when I spoke in SITAC, and he said, "To live is to be separated from what we were in order to approach what we are going to be in the mysterious future." And this is from his Dialectic of Solitude, the essay In the Labyrinth of Solitude. And I think that's a very wise statement. It's about our desires. And I felt very strongly 2012, Mexico City was a time for me to express and share the prospect and the job of desiring a future.
Very good. I think that there is a I don't know how to put it. I'm always kind of caught in the horn of the contradiction of these poiesis, this coming to being of things in the future, this enunciation as a form of shaping the world, which of course, as I world in this field, this is the way I am, I believe in this fundamentally. And this break with the conditions of the present, which are messy, complex, which demand a kind of fighting back or a search for positionality that is much more concrete, which brings me to Karin's edition, where she took on one of the hardest topics for many different ways, which is justice. Justice as a desire, as a human desire, and also as the impracticalities of attempting to address justice through artistic practice. And yet the entire project also had at its core this same envisioning of a better future. Karin, can you speak of your edition in regard to this topic?
Yes, certainly. And I also just want to express my delight and appreciation for the invitation. And it is just such a pleasure to be together again, and particularly to see you, Lucia, who was such a significant partner for my CITAC. I also remember that I would open every single panel that I chaired with an apology for speaking English and not speaking Spanish, and unfortunately nothing has changed in that regard. So thank you for indulging me in this limitation that I bear. I would like to go back to what Pablo said, and when he spoke about the focus on art and art practices, but I also want to emphasize the word absurdity. And the title, of course, of the CITAC that I curated, Arte Justamente, Just Art, is a play with words. So it's just art, therefore, not significant or maybe significant. And of course, it has this aspiration to be just, whatever that may be. Going back, Lucia, to your question about what we take away from the CITAC that we curated, in my case, was it like 6 years ago or 5 years ago, and what seems relevant today? I mean, on the one hand, I would love to say that, I've learned a lot, that things have changed, that my thinking has evolved. And at the same time, I find myself in a situation where the same questions are still absolutely determining every single move I make every single day. And those considerations and recognitions are that art is a process, that aesthetic practices only happen in exchange with a public, and the moment they reach a public, that aesthetic practices or art practices with ethical aspirations are even more subjected to the specificity of a moment and conditions in which they happen. Very much like any notion of justice that, of course, is never, ever achieved and is valuable and a goal worth pursuing simply by virtue of its aspiration and the hopefulness and the projection into the future. Speaking a bit also, Lucia, to what you spoke about, the specificity. So this proposition that we would look at art with ethical aspirations came out of the work that I've been doing at the Verlis Center for Art and Politics at the New School. And it came with a recognition that if we wanted to continue that work in a context I did not know, that I had been invited to initially by Pablo, who had suggested I submit an application, it would be absolutely, we would have to start with the host who has invited us to present our way of thinking and working through these questions. And so the notion of host and guest and arriving in order to learn, showcasing art and art projects, but only once they've been embedded and presented in collaboration with local organizations and local artists. That was the absolutely defining concept of CITAC. I think it's the 11. Sorry, I don't want to call it my CITAC, but it really, it was everyone's CITAC at the time. So it was for me, absolutely logical. 3 days of a conference was not what I was interested in. It didn't seem appropriate. We wanted to really bring different viewpoints, invite other viewpoints, but ensure that these mutual encounters can happen. And so, Lucia, with your help, we organized short-term residencies for 3 art projects that were that had been were developed around notions of justice. And as you said, it was one day was that eventually of the conference was dedicated to food justice, one to education justice, and one to gender justice. The artists were in residence with local organizations in Mexico City and beyond, and then came back for CITAC for the 3 days conference. Again, notions of reciprocity seemed important. Time, arriving in order to learn. We also wanted to be as inclusive as we could be. So each day was anchored by a communal lunch where everyone who had cared to pay attention to the proceedings, as an audience member and the speakers were meeting over lunch. And those were, maybe some of the most interesting conversations happened in those moments. Maybe just one last thing I want to say is that, the focus of the CITAC on art and justice came out of the work I did at Vera List. We had done 2 years of programming on post-democracy. We'd also done a lot of work on indigeneity. So it seemed a legitimate proposition to address that intersection. 6 months after I had been invited, this horrific murder happened of the 43 students in Ayotzinapa in September. I think it was at the end of September, and we were here, talking about art and justice, and it was an absolutely sobering moment and crucial that we had already established, with your help, Lucia, the connections with local organizations, and the artists that we worked with had approached the topic with humility, and we decided to simply proceed with the conference as it had been planned and with the short-term residencies as they had been designed. I still am really troubled by that juxtaposition, and at the same time, I think we did the right thing. And when you ask, Lucia, how the thinking has evolved or what the core concepts are that we now reflect on that come out of CITAC, it was definitely questions of justice, ethical aspiration, indigeneity, but then also in the meantime, I think a greater recognition that injustice is systemic and goes far beyond individual situations.
It was such an extraordinarily intense time for me as well. And I remember I'm recalling now the very deep and important discussions that we had with the board of CITAC, whether in fact it was even possible to have the event, given the fracture in the evident the evident fault in Mexico in relation to justice with the 43 students of Ayotzinapa. And I remember very clearly that a sense of deep discomfort during the symposium itself, which I think it might be sort of important to bring Patricia into this dialogue at this point, as Patricia has been so structural to exactly the kinds of discussions that the board and the committees at CITAC behind the scenes and at PAC have been having all along, in order to really give the proper cobijo, the proper standing to this shifting platform. Patricia, maybe we could start from the beginning. We could start from Arte Justamente, which was actually such a shocking moment, I think, for all of us, if you wish, or we can start from the beginning, whatever you wish. You don't have your microphone on.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Lucia. Yeah, I don't think there's a beginning and an end to this, really, and nor a middle. It's a constant movement that we have been creating and also reacting to. This is probably the essence of CITAC in the long run, is that we are in constant flux. And first of all, I wanted to start by saying how strange it is to be not dragging you to Mexico, but traveling towards you or traveling with you at this very moment. And so this is the first virtual CITAC that we've ever had. And I think that it is a new beginning for a new model, perhaps a hybrid model, where we do not contaminate so much, where we don't spend so much money or whatever. I don't know. We are going to have to discuss it. And really this gathering of many directors of CITAC, unfortunately not everybody was able to participate, but it is a moment of self-reflection that we wanted to share with you, and for you to be the voices that we are hearing today because of your experience. No? In the last two sessions, we had some, for example, Gabriela Rangel spoke of her experience of CITAC as something very painful at a given moment, because she was dealing with a subject that was at that time verboten in Mexico, which was feminism, and in a very patriarchal society, as you know. I think that the profoundness of things that happened around CITAC is also a very strong, that is what we cannot control. Those who are thinking about CITAC prior to the actual event, we can foresee a certain program, but in the actual fact, it is what it is once it's over. And this is unfortunately what happened with Karin's CITAC, which, by the way, broke all of the models that we had previously worked with. And I think that each and every one of them has had this alien element to it, where we were thinking that we were reacting to something that was interesting for the Mexican community, but at the same time, the Mexican community came in to change the reality of each and every CITAC. And as Pablo said, starting chronologically with the ones who are present, Pablo Helguera's CITAC was a massive event. We had to keep people out of the theater because we just couldn't handle that amount of audience. And it became like the speakers had a fan club. Each and every one of them had their own following. It was very startling for us to see the result of that one. With Shuda, I remember Shuda brought me to tears because we were remembering Olivier Debois at the time. But this morning I woke up looking at all of your CITACs, and I could not help but be surprised by the talent and the enthusiasm that each and every one has brought. And with Karen, for example, I was not very close to that CITAC because she decided to spread it all over Mexico. So that was very difficult for me to follow at the moment. And also we had made a change, which was that we had an external committee instead of being ourselves at the board that organized that CITAC. We had invited a group of external advisors. There was Isa Benitez, who is now part of PAC. There was Solenaro, there was Benjamin Mayer, Alejandro Hernandez, Pablo Helguera, Sofia Olascuaga, and Mariana Munguia, who were the team behind that CITAC. So really what it is, it's a program that changes and changes and changes, even though we may have a mission statement behind the model, which we, by the way, borrowed from Guillermo Santamarina, who had done that in the 90s in Guadalajara, but he had baptized as FITAC, and then we had to change the name for legal purposes. But what it is that we have to keep true to the fundamental idea that theory is a very useful tool to open a conversation and to be able to navigate around this notion in many, many, many directions. So basically, I think that we can talk a little bit more later on about how this model is so flexible and how we would like for it to move into the future.
Thank you very much, Patricia. There are lots of issues that we need to pick up on, and particularly that one. I have been struck in the conversations that some of you may have heard in the last 2 days by the fact, of course, that as we are speaking to directors and to board members, and the focus has been on the conceptual structure around the symposium and what it has offered in terms of bringing intellectuals of all over the world, Latin America, Europe, India, etc., to Mexico to be part of this context, and generated a kind of energy that was not there before and that seldom happened outside of CITAC. And I have to say one thing, though, which has been, I think it has been addressed in other conversations, which in this, centering this discussion this way, we have somewhat pushed aside the idea of what happened to those people that are not seeing themselves as represented in this group. The internationalist sort of tendency of CITAC in some ways created also the feeling that those that were not part of CITAC were really outside of contemporary art. So it's not something that I can ask each of you in that particular way, but I do think I can ask it in terms of your own experience, Pablo, in relation to this, as you're so very keenly aware of the differences between contemporary art as a field, as a market, contemporary art as a discursive structure, and then practices of being in the world as an artist, for example, practices of engagement. So you had 1,000 people. You had 1,000 people that came to hear all these fantastic and famous speakers. And yet there are another 1,000 or 2,000 people that did not feel represented by that. So how do we come to terms with that?
So it's a very good question, Lucia. And I don't know if I can answer it fully, but I can say the following. I think we need to remember that CITAC is born at a really important time in Mexico, which is the moment after the boom of the 90s, a moment where suddenly the Mexican art scene is on the map, right? And there is a proliferation of careers and art that become suddenly very ubiquitous in many parts of the world. With that growth, there's a dominance, I think, there was a dominance of the gallery art scene and the idea of art as a commodity that was becoming something that I felt in Mexico was almost like we were drunk with, you know, and like there were like many artists just basically fascinated by the idea that suddenly your art, you know, could be purchased and collected everywhere. So I felt that there was that market dominance that needed to be addressed through something more substantial, and I think CITAC came to the rescue to offer something much more substantial. Now, with that dominance as well, there were practices that I felt were not properly supported, or I felt they were a little felt sidelined. One example is performance, and as you know, performance is a practice that in Mexico has not been aligned with the markets. Typically, it's hard to buy a performance piece. Anyway, but I felt at the time that there was this. I think it's a fact. There was an entire culture of performance that felt that did not belong to that world of Mexican museums and galleries. They have their own world. That's why for me it was really important to bring Marina Abramovich to CITAC. And when I called Marina and presented this idea to her, she immediately said yes. She said, "Oh, nobody has ever invited me to Mexico ever, and I'm dying to go." And it was really quite interesting to bring her, and also in conversation with Rosalie Goldberg, who was also new to Mexico, and have a conversation of her background and experience, which I know for a fact it was incredibly important for an entire sector of the art scene in Mexico that was very invested in the subject of performance. I think similarly, the other artists that spoke as part of that CITAC, specifically Hans Hake and Shirin Eshat, were engaging with political issues that were not, I don't think it was that common at that moment, and they were really embraced by many. I think this goes back to why I felt it was really important to have the artist's voice in these kinds of conversations, because it made the conversation to become much more concrete, more approachable perhaps, and more tied in with specific realities that these individuals were dealing with that were relatable, I feel, to the realities that other practitioners were engaged with. So at least in that respect, I was trying to amplify the importance of the ideas that were being discussed in these events.
Thank you very much. Shura, I think that the question for you, I need to kind of shift it a little bit, because what I'm trying to get to is the disjunction between this figure of the shaman and the time waster that you have so powerfully pictured for us. And yet, even in your own work as a thinker and in the list of people and the way you ran this symposia, there is also attention to the actual political context. The dirtiness, the dirty word of the present in a way. So, I mean, not only in terms of expanding audiences and making this less of an international symposium of really cool people that are hanging out and having lunch by themselves, in relation to Karin's point earlier that she very definitely said we are going to have lunch together with everyone who participates. But how did the CITAC help you in thinking through that? The disjunction of the figure, the futuristic visionary, and the necessity of political engagement.
Well, one of my key points of thinking for CITAC was actually a thinker whom I found surprisingly neglected in Mexico City at that time, especially given the history of CITAC. And for me, that was Ivan Illich. I was constantly, it was like Ivan Illich was haunting me. There were two people haunting me in CITAC. One was Olivier Desbois, and the other was Ivan Illich. And I think that my effort, if you like, as a shaman, was to kind of create a conversation between these two gentlemen and what they were insisting on, that both of them insisted that the future begins right now and the world is right here. The second lesson, the world is right here, is something that I learned from Olivier Desbois in 2002 in a conversation in his house where there were a very few people present. There was, I remember, Magali Ariola, I think Mariana, Patricia, Cuauhtemoc Medina, Olivier, and myself. And we talked about the strange currents of history that had brought people to Mexico from all over the world in the early 20th century, which included Magali's ancestors, which included the strange and enigmatic figure of M.N. Roy, who came from my part of Eastern India to found the Mexican Communist Party in Mexico City out of sheer set of strange accidents and circumstances, and various other kinds of people who actually posited a very different figure of what we consider to be internationalism. This is the internationalism or the sideways vernacular cosmopolitanism of the early 20th century and the late 19th century. And Mexico was a beacon for that vision of the world, which was planetary, which could allow people to begin to rethink the entire history of the planet from Mexico City. And it was considered to be an absolutely central position, but it was not peripheral to the universe. It was not peripheral to the imagination of the world and the planet. And therefore, it could be rethought again. Sitting in that room that day in 2002, which was my first SITAC, the SITAC that was led at that time by Eric Camara, which was quite remarkable in its own way, and which exposed me as a much younger artist at that time to a set of planetary conversations. It gave me a confidence to think about the fact that when we think the world, it doesn't have to be a Eurocentric conception of what this world can be. There can be many different planetary imaginations. And that was something I never experientially understood before I came to SITAC in 2002. I may have understood it as an abstraction. I may have understood it as a desire, but I did not understand it as a physically embodied reality. And that is one of the lessons that I was carrying. The second lesson was about emergency and emergences. There's a remarkable conversation that I invoke in which Ivan Illich talks about water, shit, sanitation, and health in Mexico City in the wake of the earthquake. And he talks about the incredible difficulty of pumping water up to the altitude of Mexico City to make it pure and to make it drinkable. And how many flushes can the average inhabitant of Mexico City afford? And he made a count, 17 flushes per person in a month. It's a very interesting calculation. And he said that what this produces, he says, what is marvelous is the city survives at all. And that's why I always think that Mexico City is the city of the future. Because today, this condition, it is marvelous that New York survives at all. It's not a statement we could have made in 1989 or 1990. Today, it is possible to make it because the devastation of urban civic infrastructure that is now a planetary reality makes it possible for us to think about emergency situations in cities as varied as New York or London or, for instance, Delhi. So in the city that I come from, Delhi, the recent crisis has been not only of water, but of air, of being able to breathe, of oxygen. And what I found before that, for instance, in a city like Athens, where we had a similar breakdown of civic infrastructure, what emerged in Mexico City, in Athens, in Delhi, in London, in many other parts of the world, are the fact that inhabitants produced the conditions of survival. The state gave way, the state collapsed, corporations ran away. At a time of emergency, what actually kept life going was the, if you like, the kindness of strangers. So that in Delhi, it was sort of structures of cooperation that emerged between people who were reaching oxygen cylinders to each other so that they could breathe in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Questions of life and death became pregnant with the need for being rethought at a very fundamental level. And I think that is what I consider the work of the imagination to be. We've had a very long time since the Second World War where the world has basically lived with the fetish of adjustment, of making do, of reform, of changing things a little bit here, a little bit there. What I think we can sense from around 2010-11 onwards is that the entire map needs to be redrawn at a very fundamental level. This has come alive to us again now in the pandemic, where all over the world, people are having to rethink questions of what is health, what is it to be alive, what is it to care for each other. These are very, very basic questions. They can't be subjects of reform. They have to be subjects of an imagination, of an overhaul of the imagination, where the work of desire and the imagination becomes foregrounded and central. So that as an artist, if we were thinking that we were the people who came last, we were last in the priority of social transformations and movements. But I think that from Mexico City's experience, you realize that whether it's having to deal with the grief of Ayotzinapa or having to deal with the continuing grief of the Mexico Olympics in the late 1960s, which became a subject in our CITAC again, that these moments demand from us a very comprehensive renewal of all our thinking. And that's why I see CITAC in Mexico as having a role to play, not just in its own context, but as a role to play where it says, right now, here the world begins, and we talk to the entire world. And that is not a position of arrogance. That is actually a position of great humility, because you realize how difficult it is to carry on a conversation with the entire world. And that is the job of art, of artists, and of an event like CITAC.
I think it's fantastic. Thank you for reminding us of another way to look at this presupposition of an opposition between the local and the international, between the notion of the global as an extractivist force and the idea of the conditions of a place and the populations of a place, the communities of a place as naturally good. And remind us again that the 20th century had a few other models at the very least, where the international function, the cosmopolitan function, to rethink the world at the time. So thank you for that. Karin, I want to return to your CITAC, well, not your CITAC, CITAC 12. I apologize, not your CITAC. To CITAC 12, to ask you about how it is that edition helped you think of the method of address. Not only that it was a symposium, but that you actually did a kind of institutional clinic, or let's say diagnosis, or a kind of shifting of the parts in order to create a different condition for the address, for the form of address. And if that in fact helped in any way to shape your current thinking. Because you didn't just, you invited people, but by shifting the order of things, shifting the relation between center and periphery, by having the launches and many other instances, having performances, mass group performances, finishing the entire thing and so on. So if you can speak to institutional modeling, please.
Certainly. Thank you for the great question. And it's really a wonderful conversation, because it seems like we're really flowing from one presentation to the next one. So Shuda, what you pointed to and what Lucia also carves out, this juxtaposition between the local and the global is one that, it's such a complicated relationship. And it is maybe also what I try to focus on by not moving away from Mexico City, Patricia, but decentralizing a little bit what CITAC could be, and acknowledging and recognizing and listening to everything else that was happening outside of Mexico City. So that was the reason that I wanted to have the conference, but have it seen in a larger context, have it seen evaluated in a larger context, and have it seen, it had to deliver against the backdrop of the work that was being done in Mexico and elsewhere. And we had these two residencies. One was in Oaxaca with the La Curtidoria, and that was Ammar Kanwar, who had done extensive work on the rights of farmers in India, and presented a film eventually at the conference. And it seemed just really important to not just showcase his incredible project and his insights and bring him to Mexico City, but allow him to learn from these fantastic collectives, farmer collectives and indigenous groups in Oaxaca, have an exchange there, and then bring all of that back to CITAC itself. The second residency was at La Casa Azul in Tepoztlan, and that was with Sandy Hilal and Alessandro Petti of Campus in Camp. That was the one that focused on education. And again, it was a way of holding both spaces simultaneously in the same awareness, not necessarily holding them accountable to each other, but at least seeing one very specific example always in the context of another one. In terms of institutional modeling, I think I've maybe gone even further, I would hope I've gone further than what we were able to do there. So time is even more important, and nothing ever ends and nothing ever concludes. So CITAC 12 was over. We had hoped that we would produce at the very least a glossary of terms that came up in these various studios in various languages and would be inhabited and articulated and described and defined differently depending on where the writer of a glossary entry would come from. But what I'm doing now at the Verlis Center is, not unrelated. So we have a live event, and these can be like a 2-hour panel discussion, or it can be a 3-day symposium. And it's really just the beginning of, or it's one articulation of the production of collaboratively generated knowledge that then gets spun out and played out on various different other platforms, from publications to the classroom to art projects. So that would be another thing that I certainly experienced and learned at CITAC. And maybe the other thing that's worth bringing up here is the question of resources. And that's what I'm really trying to work through very carefully at the moment at the Verlis Center, in the context of American cultural organizations and the assault by the public on how they're being financed, an absolute lack of public resource that support cultural work, and then the complete reliance on private philanthropists. So, and many are wonderful, but so-called philanthropists who make these cultural organizations their own by virtue of the power of financial resources. So what I observed at CITAC, what we've been working through at the Verlis Center, is trying to understand the notion of resources in much broader ways than just financial. So it's the location, it's the site, it's the place, it's the history, it's the earth we're sitting on and occupying. It's individuals and their knowledge, their experience, their kinship relationships with their peers. It's the architecture, it's the material that is used for the museums in which we operate. And all of a sudden, it's a wonderfully liberating moment when you realize, well, our budget is tiny, but we bring, in our case, for instance, a fascinating, wonderful, creative student body, and we bring a location in New York City to partnerships and to exchanges and collaborations with others. So maybe, one could say somewhat piloted at CITAC, we've established a couple of long-term relationships with organizations, and I guess organizations that are in completely different circumstances from ours. So far, most of them are still in the US, but it's an attempt to define the contributions that we can make as an organization, and see, define resources and knowledge in other ways than just financial. So that's definitely a takeaway from CITAC. And yeah.
Thank you very much, Karen. It actually bears relevance to the discussion, absolutely, because CITAC as well as PAC are very unique in the Mexican context in the sense that they are privately funded for the most part. Correcto, Patricia?
Absolutely.
In a country where most institutions are publicly funded in whatever way, in whatever measure, and in whatever relation to the government at the time. In Mexico right now, we're going to a very, very complex transition from a government structure that positioned art and culture in a certain way in relation to power, definitely gave more importance and budget to this, to a government structure that is attempting to rethink what culture is in relation to a larger group of population. Within this structure, almost uniquely, Patronato de Arte Contemporáneo has been basically holding the back of a lot of different enterprises, CITAC being one of them. Nevertheless, it happens in a context where art is public, culture is public, which is different than the US. As you know, I have worked in the US for many years. And in the US, art and culture may not be public always. In fact, they're rarely public. And sometimes are public despite the privatization of organizations, institutions, production, and so on. So we have the recent phenomena with anti-monuments and so on. Patricia, brings me to your question. Not only a question about your experience with CITAC, which seems to be a silly question to ask because you have been so fundamental in a way it's difficult to separate your own life experience, but you can tell me if I'm wrong, from this extraordinary machine.
I'm not going to show you my house, which is absolutely invaded by my career and my work process. But anyways, yes, I think that what I think is important here are the repercussions, and it's kind of this wave that keeps changing and moving. And I think, for example, what we were talking about with Karen right now, the decentralization of this thought group that we have, thought group of 450 people, which is quite a whole lot of people that have been speakers or moderators in CITAC. And but what is absolutely true is that at a given moment, it was essential for us to move outside of Mexico City. And that's when we created the famous nodos. Now, this of course is part of I think what we're going to talk about a little later. But I think that everything has been a result of what the previous experience was in each and every edition of CITAC, as well as this realization of where we are living and what the circumstances are and how they change. This was the original mission of CITAC, is to have an overview of what's happening in the country, politically, economically, socially, and to invite this group of experts to think with us about the reality of this country. Not necessarily, this is why I was saying that we didn't drag you to Mexico this time, but we were bringing in the foreign thought, if you want, the international thought into our home and discussing it locally and how its repercussions were going to affect our reality. We have never had the aspiration so far to make it international. The closest we've gotten is Cuauhtémoc's CITAC, which was called Sur, 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 where we were thinking more towards Latin America and the rest of the global South, which at that time wasn't even a term. It was not used as a term to describe any art scene in the world yet. It was kind of a premonition. So this is basically where I see that CITAC has made a very, very radical mark on the local scene. And by local, I mean the Republic, because we are aware that people in Oaxaca, people in Guadalajara, Monterrey, Tijuana, Mérida now are changing their art practice around the notions that they have learned in CITAC. And it's a very useful tool. It's a very useful tool because you can visit it all the time on the internet. All of the sessions were recorded and have been uploaded to the internet. So really what it is, it's kind of like this, as I say, it's a wave that is still helping us create a more comprehensive art community in Mexico. I think that that's basically what we can talk about. And yes, it's true that when at other times we have been partners with the government, because of course we cannot do the CITAC all on our own, but at other times it has been with other private institutions like Jumex. Jumex was very, very helpful at the beginning. And this is the way that we operate in a very mixed economy and with a lot of diplomacy, of course, because we need to keep these patrons, these sponsors happy. And what I would like to see is another day of this virtual CITAC, but conducted by the audience. That would be very interesting. A little bit like Karen Koni's reversal of putting the public on the stage. And I would like really to hear what our audience and our friends and our colleagues are thinking about what we are talking about today. I think we're missing that day of listening to what the result of this discussion is. I would love to hear that.
You know, I remember very well, I did not grow up in Mexico, so my first interaction with CITAC was maybe 2005, maybe it was you, Pablos. I can't recall very well. I don't have such good memory. But I do remember it was massive. There were like 1,000 people in the theater, and that people at the theater, I grew up in Canada, very polite, you know, never stand up and make an important question, take over the Q&A, all the things that this group of people were eager and excited to do. Essentially have a kind of like a football game with the opposition in the audience, or and then against the team that's on the platform. And yes, let's think about this a little bit, Pablo. Let's think not only about being inclusive and being addressing a more diverse audience and going to other parts of Mexico, but what it meant in terms of experience, yes, but in terms of thinking through what has not been said, for example, in relation to the experience of the event for you, right? Because it was often really intense.
Well, yeah. I mean, first, I think the Q&A sessions were actually sometimes very rowdy and like sometimes performatic, because there were so many people that just like stand up and then in the typical fashion are like, this is not a question, but more of a comment. Then they will give like a dissertation you know, for like half an hour. So that was not uncommon. It was a process of educating ourselves also to engage with questions, you know. I mean, I think one thing that I think is very important to point out about CITAC that I don't know, it kind of like goes beyond or transcends the 3 days of conference that we would run. It was the immense social nature of these events, which in Karin's version became much more, as you know, we have all said, you know, like very inclusive, right? Like eating in groups, eating together. But one thing that I felt really beautiful always about CITAC was that everyone in the art scene would kind of get excited and put their best shows and and do their best activities. And even though CITAC is not a biennial, even though it's not an exhibition, it had the energy and the emotion of some kind of very important event. And it was really special, the fact that it was not really about, in fact, showing works, but about speaking about ideas. And the sociability that CITAC has traditionally generated, I've always found it very meaningful. And there's so many stories that are just basically impossible to really tell because we don't know them, of the connections that happen with the presence of different artists in Mexico City. So I mean, we would hear about some of them, like they will go and then start meeting other artists who would just bring them to their studios or to their galleries or to museums, and then there will be new stories being built. So CITAC was, I think, and is still an event that becomes a catalyst for many other things that really don't enter into the record of how it benefits an art scene. And it also, interestingly, I feel it fulfills a very kind of important identity that Mexico has always had with the international art scene. I mean, if you look at it historically, you know, Mexico City has been always this place of encounter of different kinds of artists, whether they were American artists, whether they're surrealists, whether they're like the Spanish exiles, as well as many Latin American artists who just find their home in Mexico City, escaping dictatorships or other issues in their countries. I feel that there's a history of Mexico City being an epicenter of encounters that CITAC in some indirect way perhaps helped maintain. And anyway, so it's maybe more like the social history of CITAC that we have never really written about, that is more anecdotal, but that it's still nonetheless incredibly important.
And yet I want to emphasize once again, since when I returned from Canada in 2003, I went to live at the border in Tijuana for a long time, 9 years, that there was also a sense in the community in Tijuana, which was very lively and had, at the time Insight was taking place, 2003, 2005, that a sense that there were a lot of things that were not part of CITAC, and that it was actually quite difficult. One could only enter if not invited to speak as part of the clínicas and as part of the pedagogical program. And so I do think that there is a shift in CITAC that is taking place if we look at the massive conferences that connect with this idea of the cosmopolitan that Shura so beautifully described for us, and that put in question, or at least make us doubt of our positions, local, international, reminding us of another position, but nevertheless that there has been historically neglect in a certain way. And it is not CITAC's responsibility to do this or not, right? In a certain way. It's not, as an organization, it may or may not have been, it emerged organically. So Shura, my question to you would be, if I were to shift your position with Karin and ask you a question as if you were a socially engaged curator, the way Karin is, and a politically you are an activist, in fact, how would you connect in a more deep way this platform, this machine, this device to the conditions of the local? You're silent.
The most important aspect me, sorry, I have to retrieve my headphone. The sign is to stay with a question, is to consistently produce a condition for generative doubt. What is disturbing for me politically, aesthetically, is the regime of certainty of any kind. When people when people say they know what they have to do, I immediately begin to retreat into suspicion, because I think that's the first step towards tyranny. So in all conditions, at all times, in any space, we have to ask the most difficult questions, the questions that maybe are not being asked easily. And I think that the role of the artist, of the writer, is to produce the conditions for this question, and also to make possible connections that may have been sundered. In The Long Count Begins Again, the first speaker on stage was not an artist, not a curator, was a novelist, Laura Restrepo. She was a Colombian novelist, and we were very keen, my colleagues and I, that we begin by hearing, by listening, by getting the artistic community to begin to listen to the question, to the condition of what it means to dream and imagine worlds. Because I felt that in the artistic world nowadays, we talk a lot, but we don't necessarily listen as much as we ought to be listening. So throughout The Long Count Begins Again, we created these conditions where we felt, let's take a pause, let's sit back, let's listen. Politically, listening for me is a very important act. I tend to create this kind of strange separation between my artistic and aesthetic life and my political life, which is very active, but which doesn't necessarily come into the artistic life. But I do believe that there is a necessity for these two lives to listen to each other. And for me, that was the most important thing, how to create conditions where also listening between generations. For me, one of the most productive moments, which was also intensely in some ways local, was a conversation that Sofia Lascuaga took custody of, and which had to do with her research with a whole generation of architects, thinkers, pedagogues in Cuernavaca. It was very important to return that conversation to a position of centrality, because I felt that these were older men and women who had a lot of things to think about, who had experimented with a whole new life of aesthetics and politics, and who perhaps had things to say that were remarkable in their futuristic sense. They were already living in the future in Cuernavaca. And it was very important for us to try and retrieve that moment and enter into a space of active listening. So these cross-cutting conditions where artists could listen to writers, to pedagogues, pedagogues could listen to artists. It was my ambition to bring a very important social theorist from India who had nothing to do with art, the psychoanalyst and psychological thinker Ashish Nandi, who suddenly was confronted with the world of Mexican and Latin American contemporary art. He learned something from it. And I think that's kind of very important, that CITAC produces these conditions where it's not just artists who learn, but other people who learn from the encounter with art, from the possibilities that art produces.
Thank you so much for that answer. I wanted to add one thing regarding what Patsy said earlier. CITAC has been funded very strongly by various institutions, private institutions, Jumex being one, and Bancomer, the bank, with BBVA, has also been really important, among many others. And I'm getting a text from the director to acknowledge, because it's very important to acknowledge. Because in this regime, in breaking the regime of certainty that Shura is asking us inviting us to do, of course, some certainties we cannot break. So funding is necessary. But yet we have to live with a contradiction, and Karin, this is for you. of sometimes having funding or having structures that make it possible for us to work, that are actually totally, in other ways, creating disturbance in the field for the artists and the thinkers that we want to support and the kinds of conversations we want to create. So how do you not only think of CITAC as a kind of special platform where this may not be evaded at all, but where the possibility of uncertainty actually is at play? I ask this of you particularly because you are in a moment in the United States where there are a lot of social sort of dynamics that ask us to avoid uncertainty, that ask us to do all sorts of things in relation to identity, that ask us to position the institution as a kind of certain space for not only things happening, but addressing issues related to identity, to histories, and so on, which make it very difficult to do. And this is not unlike some of the things that are happening in Mexico at this moment. In other words, we have a very polarized society, increasingly polarized society, perhaps very differently from what was happening when you and I were working on the CITAC.
This word of muting and unmuting has become, the term, I mean, for 2020 or 2021. So it's an incredibly important question, and it couldn't be a more important challenge that we, I think, all need to address. I would probably veer on the side of certainty, or at least clarity. I do think we are under obligation to know and to be informed, and then to draw certain conclusions, which may not affect at all who we collaborate with or which institutions we're part of. But I do feel, I feel very strongly that, particularly as organizers and curators and people producing these convenings, we must know what makes them possible, and we must be able to explain, and we must be able to not even justify, but explain why we engage in these structures, why we depend on them, and why we continue to accept them. This is very, very far from saying, it can't be done, it shouldn't be done. It's not about a moral position, but it is one of, I guess, an ethical position where you just, you need to know. And it goes back to what I said earlier about resources and understanding, and also evaluating not just financial contributions, but other contributions that we make by virtue of being, social beings. So, and just as a little example, I certainly don't think that's a model either, but during COVID, for quite a few months, we at the Verli Center, we saved a lot of money because we couldn't invite anyone, no one could come, no dinners. So we were able then to divert some of the funding as honoraria to the speakers. We've doubled speaker honorarias ever since, but we also made small honoraria available to the public, and they could do through the chat room. And then there was a kind of a Google Doc. You could say, I would benefit from $100 the honorarium, recognizing the contribution I make as an audience member by paying attention. And we did it, we just took the first 10 for each event. We did that for a few months. And again, this is not meant to, present something incredible or something, exemplary at the Verli Center, but just to give you a sense of what I meant by saying resources, the value extends beyond financial contributions. It's also, of course, Lucia, we all know, it's an ongoing conversation. It never stops. And it's an incredibly important conversation that I, for instance, have with the New School or with our advisory board every few meetings, because the standards shift, the values change, the situation changes, and you need to continuously revisit the principles by which you engage with artists who you like, or with funders or foundations or individual philanthropists. And the goal is to avoid conflict between the motivation between different entities and embarrassment to the artists who, we ultimately try to honor.
Thank you very much, Karen. I think it's, I didn't know that you were doing this, paying an audience honorarium. I think it's a brilliant idea, a scary idea as an institutional being, as a curator that directs a museum. I cannot afford to pay an honorarium to our audience, but I do think it's it shifts the structure of what we think and how we think. I would like to invite the audience at this point to send your questions in English or Spanish. 3 of us speak Spanish, and we can translate the question if it's needed. But before ending with Patsy's statement, or rather Patricia's statement, I apologize, or rather, before going to your statement, Patricia, I also would like to just come back to the question of these issues that we are. Shura, thank you so much for this desire, for this prompt to stay with the question and resist the regime of certainty. Pablo, thank you for reminding us of the catalytic function of these kinds of gatherings and of dialogue as a form of engagement that really helped us, or continues to help us, to think through the complexities of being. Now, a very practical question to Patricia. There is, in fact, as I observe, and I think it is in the planning of the CITAC, what I mentioned before as an atomization of the program. Began as a conference, a symposia, with whatever number of guests, whatever number of audiences, in a theater, oftentimes a really cold theater. I remember being at Eduardo's, in Eduardo Baroas's edition, and just thinking, this is worse than Canada. I could actually be outside in Canada in winter and it would be less cold than here. And then started to move through edition 12 to be located elsewhere, to think about the relationship between the speaker from elsewhere and the local speaker, producer, thinker in a different way. And now the most recent editions have used this model of the nodes. The nodes take place in Guadalajara, in Mérida, etc., in Monterrey, etc., in other words, elsewhere. The nodes happen through intimacy rather than to public address, some ways, because there is a lot of work that goes on behind. Or no, am I wrong about this?
No. What shifted from the very beginning, in other words, it's perhaps interesting for everybody to know how this got around to happening, is that, as I said before, Guillermo Santamarina had done something called FITAC but it was parallel to an art fair in Guadalajara. So therefore, there was a balance, if you wish, between the art market and the thought process of what is behind the art world. When we brought it to Mexico, there was not an art fair in Mexico to start with. There was not a biennial, and this was mentioned 2 days ago by Cuauhtemoc and Ivo, is that we became known internationally for not having these two instruments, but we did have CITAC at that time. And this, as you know, was at the beginning of the century. And as we progressed into this model that we were creating, that was always moving, we realized that there was a younger group of mostly artists and curators who wanted to have, wanted us to convert it into a kind of school, like a very quick, ephemeral summer school or something like that. And that's when we created the clinics. So what we would do was to capitalize the fact that we had brought international experts and put them together in a room with a group of students who were filtered, of course. We had only room for 30 people at that time. After the clinics, we decided, and I think it was after Garinconi's SITAC, that we started thinking about other cities. And of course, this all evolves with technology, not only through our imagination and through our resources, but because we use technology as our tool. And this meant that we could start looking at other venues as a continuation of the thought process. So therefore, we would have the 3-day SITAC, and then Cristian Gomez, who is the person within the PAC who is totally in charge of SITAC, he would organize an extension of SITAC into these communities. One year it was Guadalajara, another year it was Monterrey, another year probably Oaxaca, so as to get those communities involved in this discussion, not from a teacher point of view, but as an open discussion with the population. It's not exclusive. It is not. The only thing is that those populations have a smaller community, and we are little by little expanding into larger groups. But no, it is not necessarily exclusive. We have had very good experiences with larger audiences, but we do like for the nodos to be interactive, because we don't take speakers. We bring up the questions, we bring up the theme, and we let that discussion evolve all by itself with the people who are willing and interested in participating. That's the nodos.
Thank you very much, Patricia. This is actually a really good way for us to shift into some of the questions that I'm getting on my phone in relation to envisioning the future. And at this point, I think it would be wonderful for speculation, really. I think it's rather than practicalities. How do you imagine, and this is a question for each of you, that can be in the future, now in the context of technology, in the context of this disembodied connectivity, hybrid formats. Definitely the issue of audience continues to be a threat that concerns us or is a challenge, and so on. So if you could speculate, and maybe we should just change the order. Who wants to speak first? Speculation about the future of SITAC, as abstract or as specific as you wish or have thought it. Good ideas or bad ideas.
I'm just listening. I'm not going to talk.
Okay. You don't. When I did it, yes.
I have always spoken first, so I don't want to maintain the pattern. So I'm going to shut up and let Shura or Karen speak first.
I'm going to have to then ask Karen, since you are so hesitant.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's interesting to work with different time scales and different modalities, and to have different kinds of conversations run parallel to each other. Some might conclude, others might be continuing. And what that would require is that every opportunity, every platform that allows a exchange is used precisely and as specifically for for its intention, and as successfully as can be, so that so a communal dinner is not happening online, although we've done that too, but it's happening in an actual space. A conference is hopefully in a space as well. A class can happen online because it extends over a semester, for instance. So playing with platforms, with time scales, with levels of locality, from the hyperlocal, the granular, the really, really specific, to the more abstract meta level. I think each of these inquiries demands a different way of communicating, a different platform, different modality of address, and they should all run parallel and should all happen at the same time, because we're able to activate various instruments and they are complementary to each other.
Shuda, your microphone is off again.
Well, Karen has said most of what I wanted to say. I think that there's a real need, and now also a possibility of a hybrid way of inhabiting time, of initiating processes that are both sequential as well as simultaneous, and also to free ourselves from the logic of the event. Because many of these situations in contemporary art and culture become very fixated on the production of an event as a consuming force, where all our expectations are geared towards the climax, and then there is this inevitable dissolution. Whereas what I think is possible is to actually produce a ambidextrous way of inhabiting time, where there is a regularity and there is a casualness to conversation like what we're having today, where people log in from their different vantage points. And so that the sitak of the future doesn't have to happen over 3 days. It may culminate in 3 days, or the 3 days may be a median point, but it would be preceded by and followed by a series of encounters that actually thicken the soup, if you like, of time in the sitak. I do think that we will very soon realize that there is a novelty to physical encounters, to physical co-location, because for the last 2 years, we've been all doing this, which we are doing today. And going back to physically being with other people will feel new. It won't be back to what it was. It will require a relearning of protocols of how to be with each other. The great thing about physical co-location is the possibility of things that you didn't plan for, that weren't organized, but which come as a result of the accident. Like I keep coming back to that conversation where Oliver Desbois and Patricia and Cuauhtemoc and Magali were present. For me, that is the signature of the 21st century. That produced the career of my thinking and imagination, and what I brought back to my friends Jivesh and Monica, saying, there is something really exciting about Mexico City. And that happened because of the accidental friendships that emerged out of meeting people. I still remember Cuauhtemoc as that very important presence in the audience. He was the one who would always have his hands up at first. And I said, I have to listen and try and get to know this man. I had no idea who he was. Since then, we worked on many things together. We become friends, we become family in a sense. But that was the result of the physical accident of having people together in a room. So while I appreciate this mode of what this mode of encounter does to our thinking, and that it broadens things out, but at the same time, I think we should not lose the beauty of chance and uncertainty that's present with physical encounters.
Thank you so much, Pablo.
I completely agree with everything that Shuda and Karen said. I don't know, I can add a lot more to that, but I guess I can share a confession first. In general, I increasingly, I've been a public programmer for almost 30 years, and increasingly I've had a problem with what I call spectacle education, which are these gigantic Olympic-sized events that are supposedly about ideas, but a lot of it are about spectacle and performativity. And I think it's a problem when these large-scale things, in their magnificence, they obscure the real need, which is to understand a problem or to discuss an issue. So I would say that in terms of CTAC, there's at least four ideas that I feel are important to pursue that I think have been pursued already in some ways. First is the idea of the surprise encounter, the idea that you will not encounter the same arguments, the same people, or the same circumstances that you have encountered in other places. That you get people off script, that you get to explore a topic from an unexpected angle, and that it's really connected to the place where it's actually being discussed, which is what made CTAC so interesting, that we would explore something that we were discussing in other parts of the world, but in Mexico City, suddenly, like seeing it from that light will make it different. Number two, I think, is the intimacy, which I think all of you have pointed out, the sociability of the event. The importance that it is a human event. It's about connecting people. It's about making ideas come to life. It's not about reading texts. It's not about like quoting. It's really about having debates and discussions. Number three, to me, is the what I would call the cumulative narrative of education or discussion events, which Nodos in a way did it really well. The fact that you will start locally in a very small way, and it would like grow and build to something much larger up to the culminating event. And the last thing, which I think is really not thought so much, is the relevance of the archive and the activation of the archive. I think we have always a tendency that we finish a project and then we just forget completely about it, or we dump all the information into our website and then think we have done our job. The reality is that what is left is really complex and difficult to, in fact, organize and distill to meaningful elements that can be later shared. And I think the online world can give us this opportunity, but it does take a lot of work, and it's not simply, again, as I said, creating a website where you just like dump all the content there. That's not like a thoughtful manner of doing things. It's really studying that material and being able to find those little like snippets of discussions that can be properly contextualized and used in different places. And that's where I think anything that we produce in terms of public programming becomes very useful for local context, whether it's a local or at a global level.
I have another two questions, which I'll ask you one after the other because they are a bit long, and then anyone can answer as we sort of bring this to a close, and then closing remarks and so on. Federico Hemer says, thank you all, and then asks, can you please give us more feedback on listening strategies for decentralized art projects and entities? Listening strategies for decentralized art projects and entities.
I think Karen is the best one to, well, I'm sure that knows a lot, but I know Karen knows about this a lot. Because you did a project on listening, Karen.
I did, but I mean, maybe I would just say very briefly, I think the notion of companionship is really important. So when, again, and I did want to mention one thing, the hospitality of PAC was really extraordinary. I think I came to Mexico City about 2 or 3 times, and before even developing or fine-tuning the concept, and was really introduced to extraordinarily fantastic organizations and artists, and it was just absolutely lovely. And at the time there was Maria Bostock, who was a companion, a figure like that, who is not only facilitating or organizing meetings, but will provide you with some guidance if you are a foreigner or an alien, or not just not local, I think that helps the listening process. I do think we in the art world have a huge problem with English. I think it is it's very upsetting to me that it is simply accepted more or less, that it's always in English. And of course, at CITAC we had fantastic interpreters, and it was, it's flawless, and most people did speak Spanish. But I do think the question of listening also needs to focus on what language are we able to absorb, and what can we not understand. So these are just two short ideas. Shuda.
Yeah, I think listening is absolutely key, and listening is not an easy thing. Listening is one of the most difficult human activities. So there is, in many situations, we place a lot of emphasis on the responsibility of speech, and not enough on the responsibility of listening. It is equally important. So I'm answering the question that the person had asked. It is equally important for listeners to think about how they will challenge themselves, right? How they are prepared to accept what is unfamiliar. And I want to say this as an important question. There's often a expectation that that art events must, or events in the intellectual world, must be comprehensible and must have clarity. Yes, they must. But that comprehension and clarity is not a one-way process. Just as it is very important for me to try and speak very clearly, it's also very important for an audience to accept that if they come across something that is not familiar to them, that they have to expand their horizons. This is not an expectation that we should only produce for the speaker, but a sort of generosity of acceptance of what we don't know is equally important for the audience. And the more decentralized it is, the more important it actually becomes. The second thing I want to say is, and I'm very glad, Karen, that you brought up Maria Bostock, who was my interlocutor as well. And curiously, I spent a lot of my time listening to her, because she would point me in the directions of where my questions would lead. She said, if you want to think about this, you might want to go to that neighborhood. And that it's very important. I think that each CITAC has had that person. Some of them, it has been Maria, in other places, in other times, it has been other people. But I think one of PAC's great power has been that it produced that perfect partnership between the director and the structuring. There's a kind of way in which someone like Maria, someone like Patricia also curated me, right? They shaped and they influenced how I was thinking. That's not something you find very often in museum structures or biennials and so on. There's often a situation where you come in as the expert, you produce your thinking and you leave. But that relationship, which is built over time, which is one of mutual listening, where the director has to listen, is very important. So I would say two things. The audience and the public have to be prepared to listen to things that they're not familiar with. And the director has to be someone. Each time you choose the director, they have to be the kind of person who listens to you.
Can I add one last thing, Lucia, on this topic? I totally agree. These are great thoughts. I feel this is just a spur of the moment thought, but I believe that there's a relationship to be considered between listening and authority. If there's something I've learned as an educator for many years, is that the public is generally trained or instinctively believe that they come to be spoken to or spoken at, and they sometimes instinctively expect authority to be delivered to them in the terms of ideas. And I think it is incumbent upon us as people who are interested in and engaged in this subject, in a subject that we bring to the public, to also show them that the public can also speak in an authoritative way from their perspective of the knowledge of a particular reality that they live in, that they are experts on and we are not, you know. And I think these are the opportunities that I think emerge naturally in some extent, like like in Karen's CITAC, when Amar Kanwar went to Oaxaca and like was presented with a completely new reality, right? And that's what makes it exciting to bring people from outside to encounter these new terms. So we are not gathering this group of people to just tell the public what to think or what are the great ideas that come from the world for them to absorb. It's about creating a dialogue where we present a variety of perspectives from different contexts, but that they are seen in a new light and are enriched by the knowledge provided by the specific local context.
We have a second question, which you can answer as detailed. I would suggest you answer a little faster, but it's a fun question. Things you didn't want to happen or did not happen. What failed in your expectations of what happened? Your decepciones. ¿Cómo se dice decepciones?
Disillusionment.
Disillusionment, yeah.
How were you disillusioned?
Disappointment or yeah.
Disappointments and disillusions. Not only the good things. And this question comes from a member of the CITAC committee.
Well, it's a matter, it's a way of correcting us for the future.
Okay, good. I will tell you, I can start with one disappointment that I had with the CITAC, which is that Karen was incredibly generous in allowing me a huge amount of space to work with these different groups and different artists coming to do the participatory programs in Oaxaca, in Tepoztlán, and in Mexico City. We did them very fast, which is put a lot of pressure on the production of this. And it's not a disappointment, but it was really exhausting. But then we pressured ourselves to produce something for the event. So each of the groups then produced something which was painful beyond belief by everyone who participated, because we were not ready to do it. And actually not super interesting to the audience, who was extremely critical. So the audience the audience hated those things, those participations. And then we didn't have a lot of audience, because ours was very political.
Because your audience was on the stage most of the time, which is a very good idea.
Yeah. So that was a disappointment for sure.
I will point out two things. Well, I mean, for me, like in the CITAC 4, Olivier Deroy actually called me the morning of the symposium to tell me that he was sick. And he was supposed to moderate a panel. I don't know if you remember, Patsy, this, but it was a little catastrophic. And I had to come in at the last minute to moderate one of the panels, which made them seem that I wanted to like be at the center of every panel moderating, which was, of course, not the intention. But that actually happened, and it's not maybe something I regret, but I wish Olivier had a chance to moderate a panel. And I mean, this is not a regret, it's actually something good that happened, but it's very private. It's I know that some people that met at CITAC actually fell in love.
Oh, yes. Someone just asked about this.
But it's a confidential point, but it's just to make the point that CITAC can bring people together in real ways.
Very good. Well, I think we should.
Chula hasn't said a word about his disappointment or disillusionment or anything.
He's left. See, you scared him so much. He just left.
He was so disappointed that he left.
He was so disappointed. Patricia, what did you do? All right, we'll give him a little moment to decide if he wants to come back, or his phone died and now we're without him, which would be very sad.
No, well, this is my disappointment, if you want to know.
Yes. We'll ask him privately then to give us the skinny on everything that happened behind the scenes. But I wanted to say, before giving the last word to Patricia, to close the 3-day online symposium, we can call it a symposium, but series of conversations about memory in relation to SITAC, I wanted to just say how grateful I am for Pablo, Karin, Patricia, and Shura for participating in this discussion, for following and answering the questions in such revelatory ways, which give, I think, a lot of space for future work for the committee, the SITAC committee and the team, and also for me personally to think about how we create the conditions for dialogue that is much more, that really helps us reimagine the future. My initial remarks were a little bit on the dark side, because sometimes I can be like that. And stuck as we are in our homes, I simply think that the looking jar has become cloudy. And so through your words and through your participation, the looking jar has become a lot more transparent and translucent. Thank you very much. Patricia.
Well, my thing is not very long, so I see it's 14:08. So I just have to give thanks and give credits at the very end. So I would like, just to have the final comments from everybody before we disappear. And also to tell you that I desperately want all of you to come back to Mexico. That would be, we have to invent something. Hopefully this could have been with your warm presence. I would have loved that. There's Shuda.
So you can have your information that you're hoping to have.
Yes, exactly.
Connect again.
We need his. Well, what were your disappointments in Mexico, dear Shuda?
Okay. Well, just as I was going to talk about it, I got kicked off the Zoom.
I thought you had escaped purposefully.
No, no. I was disappointed that I had no disappointments. I was warned that there will be fights, people will shout at each other, there will be disasters. I was asked to be emotionally prepared to be in therapy. None of that happened. In fact, it was like Pablo said, people fell in love. It was the most convivial, wonderful experience. So that was disappointing in a certain way. But on a serious note, I had perhaps a false expectation, because I came to Mexico with this incredible sort of awareness, hyper awareness of the importance of Mexican literature. And I felt that there was a need for there to be more of a conversation between the visual arts and literature. I was much more interested in getting that conversation going than the conversation between, say, art practice and theory, which gets done all the time. But I felt that it would be important to revisit the question of literary arts as an artistic practice. That's, for instance, why I was so keen to have someone like Laura Restrepo. She responded, perhaps because she was an outsider.
Yes.
I mean, although she lives in Mexico City, she had the curiosity that only outsiders have about an art scene. Our many efforts to get into the Mexican world of literature, which I think is even more difficult than Indian literary worlds, there wasn't enough of a conversation. I would like there to be one. If for instance, in the future, I think it's a very important thing for the visual arts to be talking to other practices. Cinema, we talk a lot to architecture, and that was strong in SITAC, but we need to be talking to cinema, to music, to literature, and I think that's something I'd like to see more of.
Okay.
You know, I wanted also to follow up on this. I cannot tell you how extraordinary it was to begin the first day of SITAC's of the 12th edition with Lydia Cacho talking about human rights, talking about the dreadful conditions of human rights and the rights of children in Mexico. And then follow that with people completely outside of the field of literature or art like Pietro Amelio, or have the concept of comunalidad explained by Jaime Martinez Luna, have actual activists, actual political scientists, actual journalists, in a moment where justice itself was being sort of torn asunder in the public life of the city. So in a sense, it was tremendous. So it was such an intense experience for me personally, this attack, that I was dizzy for about 6 months. I had some kind of brain event from the stress. Was overloaded in my tasks that year. And so I have very strange memories. I have very disjointed memories because for 6 months I was dizzy from morning to night. And so that feeling, physical feeling, together with the memories today, and together when I look at things, I remember things, but I don't remember every day. So it's the only moment in my life that I've had a memory gap, which makes it even more remarkable for me to participate today. So thank you again.
And just to finish, and if this pandemic lasts any longer, I do recommend watching old CITACs, like watching old movies or whatever, because it is extremely entertaining. And I was really astonished at the quality of each and every one of them, because so far, so good. They've been extremely good. So I can recommend that for yourselves and for our audience. I think you're going to get a lot of pleasure out of it.
So Patricia, shall we move to final remarks?
Final remarks, yes, absolutely. And I will give my little spiel at the end.
Anyone wants to add anything to this session today?
I wanted to say, first of all, thank you all for having us here. It was fantastic to be able to relive some of these stories and like these experiences. I wanted to say something that connects to something Karen said about the way that they have very imaginatively at the Verily Center reconstituted their programming during the pandemic. Last night, I actually just published an article about the topic of generosity and about artist solidarity, and I feel that connecting with one another is an act that costs nothing. It's and it's really yet something that is so nourishing to us all. Just simply making connections with one another it's something that does not take a great deal of effort, and it's very meaningful to do it, especially in moments like these where I think we all have felt very isolated. Just to connect, make human connections is important. So to me, that's what CITAC has always mattered. It was never really about the reputation. It was never really about, the big great visibility that definitely CITAC gives to everybody, but more than anything is about exchanging of ideas, and I have thoroughly enjoyed my being involvement in this project, getting to know artists, getting to know thinkers, curators, writers, and I think it's such a noble pursuit, and I really hope that CITAC lives a long life continuing to do these kind of generous exchanges.
Thank you.
I think, Patricia, it's your turn to close us.
Okay, muy bien. Well, thank you very much to all of you. And now I will, please don't go away. I'm just going to switch to Spanish. And so, let me switch the channel up here. Queridos todos, mis colegas del PAC me han pedido darle cierre a esta primera edición de CITAC enteramente virtual. Con estas 3 sesiones hemos comprobado que el futuro existe y que CITAC, nuestro entrañable Simposio Internacional de Teoría sobre Arte Contemporáneo, mantiene su vitalidad en su existencia profundamente maleable y cambiante. Cada invento tecnológico se vuelve otra herramienta posible mientras se mantengan los ingredientes fundamentales de nuestra fórmula: el talento, el conocimiento y la necesidad, Mientras se siga comprobando que estos no son productos perecederos, habrá CITAC para largo. El PAC es un hervidero permanente de talento, pero toca agradecer a todos quienes siguen esta fantástica tarea. Gracias a los directores de CITAC que se unieron a esta conversación para repasar ese intenso pasado, ahora con un poco menos de estrés. Gracias a los 347 ponentes y moderadores que llenaron a nuestro público de sabiduría durante las 14 ediciones. Gracias a los organizadores reales de este encuentro, que son Isa Benítez, Carmen Cuenca y Cristian Gómez, miembros de nuestro comité CITAC, que incluye también a Eduardo Avaroa, Julieta González y Luis Vargas Santiago. Ellos coordinaron, Carmen, Isa y Cristian, ellos coordinaron estos 3 días de la mano del equipo del PAC, encabezado por Bárbara Hernández, quien hoy dirige el PAC desde una remota playa en Francia, con el invaluable apoyo de Clara Rodríguez, Maite Valencia y Carolina Herrera, y nuestro webmaster Rodrigo Trejo. Gracias a quienes hacen posible la existencia del PAC y del CITAC, que son los 17 miembros de la mesa directiva, todos somos voluntarios, y nuestros queridos y solidarios patronos, que ahora ya suman 28, además de nuestros 6 patronos corporativos que le dan sustento y vida al PAC. Y claro que dejo para el final a la extraordinaria presidenta del PAC, Aimé Servitje, quien no se ha perdido un instante de las 14 ediciones del CITAC, que a partir de hoy ya suman 15. Y desde luego que cada uno de ustedes en el público, que sin cada uno de ustedes, esto hubiera sido un sueño de opio. Así es que gracias por estar aquí hasta el final y nos veremos muy, muy pronto. Eso espero. Adiós.
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 Bye bye.
Adiós. Gracias.
Gracias.
Adiós, adiós.